Chapter 1. The Invasion and Our New Master. On October 7th, 1950, some 40,000 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army crossed the Drichu Yangtze River in calm eastern Tibet. By the 19th of the month, they had taken Chamdo as well as the governor of eastern Tibet, Ngabo Ngawang Jigme, who had been recently appointed to the post. Thus began Communist China's invasion of my country. The newly independent India protested to the People's Republic of China, stating that the invasion was not in the interest of peace in the region. I was only 16 years old at the time, according to the Tibetan system of counting age. By then, I already had a suspicion that something terrible was looming, for I had once, snooping, seen a sign of disbelief on the face of Regent Tadrak Rinpoche as he read a letter presented to him. I later discovered that the letter was in fact a telegram from Ngabo, the governor of eastern Tibet, reporting a raid on a Tibetan post by Chinese soldiers. A few minutes later, the regent walked out of his room and gave orders to summon the Kashag cabinet. On November 11th, the Tibetan government appealed to the United Nations. To the Secretary-General of the United Nations, the attention of the world is riveted on Korea, where aggression is being resisted by an international force. Similar happenings in remote Tibet are passing without notice. It is in the belief that aggression will not go unchecked and freedom unprotected in any part of the world that we have assumed the responsibility of reporting through you recent happenings in the border area of Tibet. The conquest of Tibet by China will only enlarge the area of conflict and increase the threat to the independence and stability of other Asian countries. Only El Salvador attempted to place Tibet on the agenda of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Sadly, none of the great powers supported the move. One would have hoped, given Great Britain's historical involvement in Tibet, including the signing of bilateral agreements such as the Lhasa and the Simla Conventions, respectively of 1904 and 1914, that it would have had greater sympathy and might have stood by us, especially at this crucial moment in Tibet's history. The world seemed to have abandoned us. Great Britain and the other powers asserted there was a lack of clarity about Tibet's exact status, yet they knew very well that in 1950 Tibet was an independent nation. The status of Tibet's independence, according to international law, was confirmed later by the International Commission of Jurists in 1959, following my escape into exile. The tragic irony is that it was, in fact, Great Britain and Russia, the two empires competing for power in Central Asia in what came to be called the Great Game, who were among those responsible for muddying the waters of Tibet's international status. Great Britain, in particular, had dealt with Tibet directly as an independent nation, capable of making decisions on its own. It had even supplied weapons so Tibet could protect its eastern border against the Chinese. Yet it had also conducted bi-party negotiations with nationalist China, as if the latter had some claim over Tibet, invoking the obscure concept of suzerainty and distinguishing it from sovereignty. If you will allow me to provide some historical context, Britain chose not to appreciate the crucial difference between the Qing Empire and the modern nation-state of China. The former was a Manchu empire that had, at various times, different nations under its protectorate. Modern China, on the other hand, was claiming to be an anti-imperialist multi-nation state, not an empire. So the basic logic behind China's claim over Tibet, even in terms of suzerainty rather than sovereignty, was flawed. The failure or political unwillingness to see through this flawed logic and the refusal to accept the actual facts on the ground that showed Tibet's independence, as well as the various moves already made in the Great Game, are what had created the fog obscuring Tibet's legal status from the international point of view. Communist China's invasion impacted me personally in a profound way. I remember hearing from the sweepers at the Potala Palace that posters had been put up around the Tibetan capital city, Lhasa, asking that I be given full temporal power. I was told that street songs were being sung by people demanding that the Dalai Lama be given his majority. The opinion on what to do, however, was divided, with one side saying that the Dalai Lama was too young, while others asserted that the time had indeed come to empower me. In the end, the Tibetan cabinet, headed by the regent, decided to consult the state oracles. Star. At a certain point in the ceremony, whose tense atmosphere was unmistakable given the stakes, one of the oracles, while in a trance, laid a kata, ceremonial white scarf, on my lap and shouted, "Dula Bab, the time has come." So, on November 17th, 1950, I was enthroned as Tibet's temporal leader, 2 years before the traditional age in normal circumstances. To mark the occasion, I granted a general amnesty across Tibet and asked that all prisoners be freed. Communist China's forcible invasion thrust me into this leadership role. With a single stroke, it turned a carefree young boy into someone with the heavy responsibility of leading a nation under attack. This is why I often say that at age 16, I lost my freedom. My country too suffered the same fate. By the end of November, about 7 weeks after the invasion, Kham, eastern Tibet, had effectively fallen. As the new leader of a people faced with the threat of full-scale war, toward the end of the year, I decided in consultation with my cabinet to send delegations to India, the United States, Great Britain, and Nepal, hoping to persuade these countries to intervene on our behalf. I also sent a delegation to Chamdo in eastern Tibet with the hope that we could negotiate a withdrawal of China's army from our territory. With the Communist Chinese forces consolidating in eastern Tibet, it was decided that I should move with the cabinet from Lhasa to Yatung, near the Indian border, in case we needed to flee the country. Strangely, one of my first major acts as Tibet's ruler turned out to be the escape toward the Indian border. My mother took this opportunity to go to India on a pilgrimage, and she left accompanied by my youngest brother, Tenzin Choegyal. The People's Liberation Army, meanwhile, paused at Gyamda, near the western borders of Kham. The road to Lhasa was open, but they wanted to take the rest of the country without the use of force. We had no option but to authorize a delegation to go to Beijing to conduct a negotiation forced upon us. It was the same governor of eastern Tibet, Ngabo, who was chosen to lead this delegation. We told Ngabo that he could open negotiations with my authority on the condition that the Chinese advance no farther. In April 1951, my delegation arrived in Beijing and formal discussions began. Although there was sporadic communication with the team by wire at the beginning, thereafter there was silence while I waited at the monastery in Yadong. Then, on May 23rd, 1951, while listening to my old bush radio, I heard on the Tibetan language broadcast from Radio Peking that a 17-point agreement for the peaceful liberation of Tibet had been signed that day by the People's Republic of China and what was described as the local government of Tibet. You can imagine my shock. The broadcast went on to say Tibet had been occupied for the last 100 years by aggressive imperial forces who had carried out all kinds of deceptions and provocations, plunging the people into the depths of enslavement and suffering. I felt physically sickened by this cocktail of lies and insults. Only after my delegation returned to Lhasa did I discover what had actually happened during the negotiations. My representatives were coerced, insulted, abused, and threatened with personal violence against themselves as well as military action against the people of Tibet. As the delegation sat down to negotiate, they were presented with the already prepared text of a 10-point draft agreement. My delegation argued that Tibet is an independent country and produced evidence to support the case. The Chinese side, of course, dismissed this. They then revised the original 10-point draft into a 17-point document and presented this as a final ultimatum. Under duress, the Tibetan delegation had no choice but to yield. In the absence of any communication with me or my government, Ngabo and his colleagues had no authority to sign any agreement on behalf of Tibet. Still, the Chinese asked if Ngabo had brought the official seal of the Tibetan government, and although he had the seal of the governor of Eastern Tibet with him, he denied possessing any seal. Undeterred, the Chinese then forged new seals for each delegate and had the document signed on May 23, 1951, effectively in the individual names of the 5 Tibetan delegates. On July 14th, I received a delegation from China bearing a letter to me from Chairman Mao. I told Chinese General Chiang Ching-wu that I would reply to Mao on the issue of the 17-point agreement after I'd returned to Lhasa from Yadong and was able to consult with other Tibetan officials. Understandably, there was an intense debate within the Tibetan National Assembly in Lhasa as to whether I should return to the capital. I decided against fleeing to India from Yadong then, and turned down also an offer from the United States to broker a place of refuge. In the end, I decided that it was best to return to Lhasa, and in September 1951, the Tibetan National Assembly held a special session. Ngabo made a formal presentation of the supposed agreement. After a long debate, it was felt that we had no choice given the massive numbers of communist Chinese troops at our door. At the time, the entire Tibetan army consisted of approximately 8,500 soldiers, while more than 80,000 battle-hardened soldiers of the People's Liberation Army stood ready to march into Tibet. Tibet's small force was armed mostly with old British Enfield rifles, machine guns, and mortars. The 17-point agreement opens with a preamble that presents a fanciful revision of the history of Tibet in relation to China. The Tibetan nationality is one of the nationalities with a long history within the boundaries of China, our great motherland. Let me quote the following key provisions. The Tibetan people shall return to the big family of the motherland, the People's Republic of China. The local government of Tibet shall actively assist the People's Liberation Army to enter Tibet and consolidate the national defense. The Tibetan people have the right of exercising national regional autonomy under the leadership of the Central People's Government. The central government will make no change with regard to the existing political system in Tibet. The central authorities will not alter the established status, functions, and powers of the Dalai Lama. The religious beliefs, customs, and habits of the Tibetan people shall be respected, and Lama monasteries shall be protected. The spoken and written language and school education of the Tibetan nationality will be developed step by step in accordance with the actual conditions in Tibet. Star. Although the agreement was forced upon us, the text of the document clearly commits the People's Republic of China to guaranteeing regional autonomy and self-government to Tibet, including freedom of religion, protection of language, custodianship of our land and its ecology, and our right to exist as a distinct people with its unique culture and heritage. This agreement became the basis of my government's relationship with China until 1959, when I escaped. It also appeared to have become the basis for the position of some in the international community on the status of Tibet. There seems to be a strange contradiction here. Regardless of the geopolitical situation at the time, the fact remains that consideration of Tibet as having become part of the People's Republic of China after 1950 accepts the justification of the rightness of conquest and the validity of an agreement signed under duress. On the part of Tibet, the 17-point agreement was imposed on a coerced delegation and at the threat of a conqueror's massed army at the door. Even though Beijing would later justify its forcible invasion on historical claims of ownership of Tibet, it seems clear that, for Mao at least, at the time of the invasion of Tibet, it was a blatant land grab of an independent nation by force. His view of Tibet as independent is reflected in a statement I was told he once made to the American journalist and author Edgar Snow. Referring to the foraging for food committed by his Red Army in Tibetan areas during the Long March, Mao said that this was the Chinese Communists' only foreign debt, which would need to be repaid one day. Today we also know from archival records that in January 1950, Mao asked Joseph Stalin if the Soviet Union would lend China military transport planes to ferry Chinese troops in a plan to invade Tibet. I am told that some geopolitical scholars and historians suggest two primary motives behind Mao's invasion of Tibet in the immediate aftermath of establishing a communist government in Beijing. One relates to what Mao and his communist colleagues saw as the need to restore China's national honor, especially in the wake of what they refer to as the 100 years of national humiliation. An important part of this, according to their view, was the reclaiming of territories that had once been part of the Manchu-Qing Empire. In this regard, Mao may have felt that Tibet's independence represented a visible loss or contradiction, given Communist China's claim to all territories once portrayed as part of the Qing Empire. The second reason, the experts suggest, pertains to Tibet's strategic geography, with its borders touching East Turkestan, Xinjiang, India, Nepal, and Bhutan, and of course China to the east. In 1954, the Panchen Lama, 3 years my junior in age, whose institution is one of the most prominent in Tibetan Buddhism and closely associated with the Dalai Lamas, joined me on a trip to Beijing. Mao told him the following: "Now that the Tibetans are cooperating with the Han, our national defense line is not the upper Yangtze River, but the Himalaya Mountains." Regardless of their motivations, we found ourselves under Communist China's boot.